Welcome to Learning with UNB. In this session of Python for Data Science, we are going to understand about looping execution. That includes what is looping execution, what is an iteration, what is the iteration process, what is a for loop, and finally, what is the range function. Let's begin with understanding what is looping execution. Looping execution allows the program to repeat a specific set of instructions multiple times until a certain condition is met. Looping execution is fundamental in programming for performing repetitive tasks efficiently. This can be achieved using different types of loops, with the two most common used are for loop and while loop. The for loop is used when you know the number of iterations in advance, while the while loop is used when you want to repeat an action until a certain condition is false. Now, let's look at what is iterations. An iteration in programming refers to the process of executing a block of code repeatedly. Each time the code block runs, it is considered one iteration. During each iteration, the current item of the state is processed, allowing operations to be performed systematically over collections of data or through a sequence of steps. Loops are the structures that control these iterations, and they continue executing the code block based on a specific condition. Now, let's look at iteration process. First comes initialization. Start by setting up initial values or conditions. Second comes condition check. Before each repetition, the loop checks the condition to decide whether to continue or stop. Third comes execution. The block of code inside the loop is executed if the condition is true. Fourth comes update, changing the values or conditions to eventually make the condition false and stop the loop. Now, let's deep dive into understanding the for loop. For loop in Python is a control flow statement that allows you to iterate over a sequence of elements. It executes a block of code repeatedly for each item in the sequence. The for loop in Python is used to iterate over a sequence which could be a list, tuple, array, or string. Here is the basic syntax of for loop in Python. For item in sequence, include a code block to be executed. Let's now look at the different components of for loop from the syntax. For, it is the keyword that marks the beginning of the for loop statement. Item, it is a variable name that represents the current item in each iteration of the loop. You can choose any valid variable name. In, it is a keyword used to specify the sequence of elements over which the loop iterates. Sequence. It can be any iterable object such as list, string, tuple, range, etc. The loop iterates over each item in the sequence. Code block. It is indented under the for statement and contains the code to be executed for each iteration of the loop. The code block is executed once for each item in the sequence. As I already mentioned previously, you can also use a for loop with other iterable objects like strings, tuples, or even a range of numbers. The loop will iterate over each item in the given sequence and execute the code block accordingly. One of the most important points to remember is that proper indentation is crucial in Python to define the scope of code block within the for loop. The code block is executed once for each item in the sequence until all items have been processed. Let's now look at the pseudocode representation of it. Step 1. Determine the sequence of elements you want to iterate over. Means pick the list or collection of items you want to loop through. Step 2. Use the for keyword followed by a variable name and the in keyword followed by the sequence. Means use for with a variable name in and then the sequence. Step 3. Indent the block of code to be executed for each element in the sequence. Means indent the code you want to run for each item in the sequence. Step 4. Execute the Python script to see the block of code executed for each element in the sequence. Means execute your Python script to see the code run for each item in the sequence. Now, as you can see on the screen, here the image is a flowchart for a for loop. It shows steps involved in a for loop, starting with start, then checking if it's the last item. If not, then it executes the statements and loops back to the check. If it is the last item, it ends the loop. This is what an example using a flowchart. Here are few examples demonstrating for loop. In the first example, we have a list of numbers starting from 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. We are using a for with a variable name number followed by in and then the list numbers. Here we have print statement after the indent, which is the code that will run for each item in the list. When we run the script, it will print each number in the list one by one. Let's execute this and check. As we discussed, the output is 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. In the second example, we have a string message with the value hello students. Before the loop, print message will output the entire string. Now, print for loop begins indicates that the loop is about to start. Here we are using for with the variable name char, followed by in and then the string message. Indent and print char statement, which is the code that will run for each character in the string. When we run the script, it will print us each character in the string one by one. Let's execute and check. As we discussed, it is giving the output in the same way. This way, each character in the string message is printed on new line one at a time. Now, let's move on to the next topic, that is range function. The range function in Python is a built-in function that generates a sequence of numbers. It is commonly used in loops to iterate over specific range of values. Here are the key concepts associated with range function. First comes basic syntax. The basic syntax of range function is range within brackets, start, stop, step. It creates a sequence of numbers. The function takes up to three arguments. The starting point, which is inclusive, means where to start. The ending point, which is exclusive, means where to stop. And the step size, which is optional, means how much to increment each step. If not specified, the default start value is 0 and the step size is 1. Second comes generating a sequence. The range function generates a sequence of numbers from the start value to the stop value, incrementing by the step size. Range function makes a list of numbers from the start value to just before the stop value. The stop value is not included in the generated sequence. Third comes using in loops. Range function is commonly used in loops, such as the for loop, to iterate over a specific range of values. The loop variable takes on each value from the generated sequence in each iteration. Now let's look at the pseudocode representation of range function. Step 1. Determine the start, stop, and optionally the step size for the range of numbers. Means decide where to start, where to stop, and optionally how much to increment at each step. Step 2. Use the range function to generate the sequence of numbers. Means use the range function to create the sequence of numbers. Step 3. Use the generated sequence of numbers in a for loop to iterate over the range. Means use a for loop to go through each number in the sequence. Step 4. Optionally perform operations using the current number within the loop. Means inside the loop do whatever you need with each number. Step 5. Execute the Python script to see the block of code executed for each number in the range. Means execute your code to see the actions performed for each number in the range. Here are a few examples demonstrating range function. In the first example, here the range 1 to 6 means the sequence starts at 1 and stops before 6. The default step size is 1. Range 1 to 6 generates the sequence 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Here we are using a for loop to iterate over each number in the sequence. Inside the loop, print num outputs the current number. When we run this code, it prints each number in the range. Let's execute this. As we discussed, it printed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now let's move on to second example. In the second example, here the range 2, 11, 12 means the sequence starts at 2, stops before 11, and increments by 2. Range 2, 11, 12 generates the sequence 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Here also we are using a for loop to iterate over each number in the sequence. Inside the loop, print of num outputs the current number. When we run this code, it prints each number in the range. Let's execute it. As we discussed, the output is 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. Now let's move on to the third example. In the third example, total is set to 0. This will be used to sum the numbers. Range 1 to 6 means the sequence starts at 1 and stops before 6, generating the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. We are using a for loop to iterate over each number in the sequence again. Inside the loop, total plus equals to num adds the current number to the total. After loop finishes, print of total outputs the final value of the total. Let's execute and check the answer. The output is 15. Now, let's move on to the last example. In the last example, capital N is set to 55, which represents the upper limit of our range. Total is set to 0, which will be used to accumulate the sum of numbers. Range of 1, n plus 1 means the sequence starts at 1 and stops before 56, since n plus 1 is 56. This will generate the numbers 1, 2, 3, so on till 55. Here we are using a for loop to iterate over each number in the sequence generated by the range 1, 56. Now, inside the loop, total plus equals to number adds the current number to the total. After the loop finishes, print of total outputs the final value of total. Let's execute this. The output is 1540. This is all about today's lecture. See you in the next lecture. Thank you.